Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age. A dialogue with our global multi-stakeholder community, representing national and local governments, international policymakers, civil society, NGOs, the ICT industry, as well as other relevant organizations and institutes.
And I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with Paul Timmers. Paul, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Allow me to introduce Paul Timmers. He's a research associate with Oxford University, specifically the Oxford Internet Institute. He also teaches at a number of other universities around Europe. He is on the board of the Digital Enlightenment Forum, which we'll definitely cover later. And he has been working for the European Commission for over 25 years, and he ended as the Director Digital Society Trust Cybersecurity at DG Connect. Now, if you look at Paul's hashtags, it includes European Commission, cybersecurity, and digital sovereignty. So Paul, again, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, a very impressive background. And I want to start off by just asking you, what are the questions, because if you Google what you're passionate about, what you have talked about recently, it's very much around a statement. Cybersecurity is forcing a rethink of strategic autonomy. And strategic autonomy of digital sovereignty is one of your topics. Can you please expand on that?
Yeah, let me say a little bit about it. I mean, strategic autonomy and sovereignty has a lot of my interest, triggered by what is coming from, let's say, the digital world, because things are changing there. So a bit of the context, I think that strategic autonomy is really about means that you can safeguard and strengthen your sovereignty. And your sovereignty is about the things that you find important. Your territory is traditionally, but nowadays, certainly also your values, your culture, the things that you have as natural resources, but even digital resources. Like, you might say that, for example, my health data or the health data of all of us in our country is something like a national digital asset. So they are part of what you might consider sovereignty. And how do you strengthen that? You do that through strategic autonomy. And why is digital playing an important role? Well, always the topic of sovereignty has been on the table since many, many hundreds of years, because there are these kind of threats between countries. And it's perhaps a negative setting, but that's what it is about. It's countries originally that wanted to defend themselves towards other countries. Nowadays, what you see is that geopolitical tensions do play a role, and they are certainly not decreasing, they are rather increasing. And secondly, you see the digital changes that are so disruptive and also have led to the domination of a number of players, commercial players, or countries behind which, commercial players behind which are again countries. That's upsetting the system already. So there are already these two forces, the digital change and the geopolitical pressures. And then cybersecurity has come into play, because that's almost like lighting the fire. Okay. It is igniting disruption. It's creating cyber attacks. It's really unsettling countries to the core of what they are about. So that's why this topic is, I think, kind of hot, especially due to cyber.
Now, on what level should one seek strategic autonomy? Is that on a national level, or is that on European level? So who should work together, and how do we do that?
Yeah, it's kind of traditionally, you would say, because strategic autonomy is about your sovereignty, you are thinking of a country. But effectively, of course, countries safeguard their sovereignty also by working together with others. And that's what we do, multilaterally or in settings like the EU. So I think that the changes that are coming from the digital world, and also the geopolitical challenges and big challenges like cybersecurity, climate, are so significant, it's impossible for most countries to do that on their own. They have to work together with others. And then I think erroneously, that is more than once presented as if it is a lose-lose, a win-lose. You know, you may lose some national sovereignty because you can gain something by working together in the EU. I don't think that's as simple as that. So let me take an example where you actually see that it is possible to have a win-win. A thing like .eu, that's something that we have created in Europe. It doesn't belong to any single citizen or any single country. Nevertheless, it's a digital asset that we all own. Thanks to that, we have an identity not only in Europe that we can use, but also in the world that we can use. Another example, if we talk about combating cyber threats, most countries are too small to do that on their own. So they have to work together with others. And with that, actually, they defend better their national sovereignty. And they also create a presence as a collaboration of countries like the EU in their cyber security strength. And with that, they also have a voice in the world. And I think that's what it is all about, actually seeing that it is not necessarily giving up only your sovereignty because you work together with someone else. You try to seek the win-win in this kind of collaboration. And I think that in many, many instances nowadays, we see companies, citizens, but countries are too small to do it on their own.
No, I agree that. So it's just so it's still about collaboration, but rethinking how we collaborate with each other.
Indeed, yeah. And then there are several ways that we can collaborate. So one way of collaboration is that we say, well, we only work with like-minded parties. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of understandable, but it may be wise to consider in a number of cases whether we shouldn't have global collaboration, because the threats or the challenges that we have are actually global, and we will need to have all parties on board. And we know, of course, it's difficult to do that, but even if we start off with a collaboration of like-minded parties, mm-hmm. we may have to consider how do we bring this actually to a global level. Very important.
And when you talk about like-minded parties, am I correct to assume that doesn't mean those parties have to be part of the same geographic region? It could also be organizations, countries on the other side of the world, but are like-minded in their thinking.
Absolutely. Take the example of future telecommunications networks, 5G, beyond 5G, 6G. These are kind of the infrastructures that we want to have that should work globally, and they should, because we want to interoperate. We want to do commerce and contacts and communication across the world. So in principle, everybody has an interest in it, but it gets difficult when we are talking about the security of these networks, 5G security. And it becomes really difficult if we think that behind this security, there are actually state interests. There are ulterior motives that we don't trust. Then we destroy collaboration. And if we destroy collaboration, we are not going to have that type of interoperation of networks. We will not have a global 6G. So I think in the development of the next generation of networking, take beyond 5G, 6G, we absolutely need to get India, with Brazil. We need to work together with other countries and preferably globally to find the standards and the ways of working that allows us to create a global network. Even if within that global network, we would say there are certain parts that we want to protect, especially because this is where national sovereignty, national security is at stake.
That's quite a tricky balance because, so to reiterate, it's on one hand, we're collaborating with like-minded organizations, nations, but you realize that once you go too far, then you're missing the opportunity to keep the technology working on a global level. Because if you push too far, that might lead that we're going to split up the global network.
Yeah, and I think you're quite right on that. So we have here this kind of these two parts, you might say, of the equation. One is the technological perspective, and the other is the more social perspective, the social constructs that we have, our laws, our governments, our values, our norms. And I think it's important that we keep in mind that we can actually modify at both sides. So we don't need to take the technology for a given. We might also say, can we have a technology that actually allows us to protect the core of our values and we still want to interoperate? Would that be possible? Would we be able to think of different technological architectures that perhaps change the governance model? And we see examples of blockchain is an example where the technology, being as decentralized and distributed as it is, affects the governance. And conversely, if we want to have a distributed governance, we might look at blockchain as perhaps a way forward. So there is this kind of old notion of code is law, that the code would determine what we can do at the law side. The software code would determine the legal possibilities that we have. I think nowadays we often say, but hey, we should also say code is law. Law is code. We should put it in both directions. We can put in law, so let's say our governance constructs, what we want to have, and then expect the technology to find a suitable solution for that. Now, all of that is pretty theoretical, but there are practical examples where we see this. And so I think personally that, for example, we have created problems in 5G security by doing a technological construct of 5G security that didn't allow for sufficient protection of national security and still interoperate globally. So I think there's single hold now for other technologies that are coming up, like AI, as I already said, like blockchain, Internet of Things. We will have a similar kind of challenge there. Design it in a way that fits with the governance that we want to have.
But if you go down that route, that would require a radical rethinking in the governance structure. Because if you're going to continue with the idea, okay, code is law and law is code, the people writing that law or governing that law really need to understand what that code is. Otherwise, it's going to be an absolute black box.
Absolutely. So I wrote an article at which the end of it, I say that I would like to see that we get co-design of law and code. So lawmakers, and I'm a lawmaker myself, are not naturally thinking in terms of the technology and how the technology could be adapted. And I have been a software developer myself, and I know you would not be thinking about governance and law at all when you're doing the coding. So it's not necessarily unwillingness, although there is a degree also of an agenda that may be behind that. It's not necessarily unwillingness. It's first of all, it's a matter of awareness and education. Can we do it? Absolutely, we can do it. You see that there are now developments of this sort happening. A small example, in the proposed law at European level, they wrote something in there which are called regulatory sandboxes. And the regulatory sandboxes actually allow for this co-design of law and code, of AI, how you would implement, design, how you would use it, and the corresponding governance and law that fits with that. It's only a beginning, but it indicates that people are taking it seriously. So education, we need to put actually in the courses that software developers and legal and lawyers are getting, just to mention those two parties. We also need to put it to the test. And actually, isn't it very strange that we don't do it? Because this is what we do. In practice, what happens, we think that the law is there forever, but no, people are hacking the law constantly, legally or illegally. So we just have to be a bit smarter than what people already are doing, well, outside our system of lawmakers, policymakers, and software developers.
I like that thing. I like that example. Thank you for sharing that, Paul. To what extent is this a typical European approach? The whole the legal sandbox you just mentioned as a way to experiment with what's going to work or not. Do you see this working on a global level?
I think it's of course easily said we have to make it work at a global level, but I think we do. So already in the very beginning of the internet, in fact, the internet was politicized. At that time, it was already said by John Perry Barlow governments, you have no place in the internet that we are designing. So that was actually saying we are designing a technology in which your traditional governments doesn't have a place. Shows clearly the technology and the social construct interplay. Whether it was the right approach, you can wonder about, but the awareness was already there. I think in the internet community at global level, always the awareness has been there that there is this close interplay between technology and the governance that we do around it. If I look at something like ICANN, for example, that's where you see it, IETF. So I think there is potentially a fertile ground, in particular at global level, to look at it. It is, of course, harder when you look inside companies where people are tasked in their software development department, just do this, and where they may not see the larger agenda that is behind it, or where you have a corporate lawyer who needs to defend a very particular interest and doesn't take the wider responsibility. And that's got everything actually to do with the topic that we have on the table here about accountability. I think there has to be this increased awareness of this type of accountability because and if you cannot say, I didn't know it. You actually know that there is this mutual influence and you can put it into the way you work, whether you're a lawyer, a corporate lawyer, or whether you're a software developer.
Got that. Now, in your mind, in your view, which parties should be at the table to make this a success?
Yeah, I think it's of course easily said. It has to be multi-stakeholder. I think that's easier said than done. I think we also kind of have to be pragmatic. You need to know what you want to deliver. If you work together, you also need to have a strategic plan. Otherwise, you continue floating in outer space and nothing will come from that. And we need to have solutions. So I'm looking, for example, at this moment a lot at which kind of technology alliances could we have?
Yeah.
Well, in technology alliances, you do want to have some presence of government, some presence of industry, and some presence of other stakeholders who are concerned, like civil society. But it's not always easily organized. So I think we can validly make a distinction between what we do right, where we need to act, and the direction that we are taking. If we keep in mind that ultimately the direction should be more inclusive and in many cases also more global rather than national, we can make that part of our strategic planning. Meaning you do the outreach while you are developing your solutions to a wider community. There's then a second part to it is I think we need to develop better methodologies for co-creation, for regulatory sandboxing, for involvement while the law is already effective. So for experimentation and for feedback, for oversight and monitoring.
Okay, so well, you mentioned, okay, it needs to be a global level, multi-stakeholder, inclusive. I understand the need for that. At the same time, how are we going to cope with the speed of things, in the sense that what you talked about actually is quite a tedious, time-consuming process, whereas the way technology is developing is moving faster than the legal framework can keep up with. So is that still the route to go, or do you see other ways to organize accountability?
Yeah, I think it's very tempting to use the speed argument, but the speed argument is also a social construct, something that is imposed upon us as a norm. Mm-hmm. And we might say, perhaps we want to accept that norm. So who's determining the norm that we have to follow the speed of technology development? So that's one thing. Secondly, of course, there is to some degree something unavoidable in it. So we will have to cope with the fact that there are developments happening much faster than we actually can cope with in our existing governance. So we will also have to adapt our existing governance. And in particular, I think the EU to get to faster decision making. Thirdly, I think there's a kind of an unexplored area. So I mentioned this co-design of law and code, or law and technology. I'm not convinced that that is actually going to go slower, because you get, as we always know, you have different development methods that are iterative, that are Scrum-like methods that may also hold to a degree for law. But I think we need to challenge ourselves in several ways in our assumptions. Is it really true? Do we work with governments that shouldn't we indeed improve our governance? Should we think of really new governance, let's say cooperation methods? So I think that the speed argument is an excellent trigger to make us think about what we actually do and who we are.
No, I think you are addressing something very important, as indeed challenge that assumption that speed is an issue. So it's good to bring that up, and at least it helps us to think about ways how we can develop what I would call 21st century solutions for what basically is a 21st century issue.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I think it's that realization. When we started off, we know, of course, well, Fritz, we have been in the business for a long time. Digital would change everything. The internet would be the big maker of great change in society and democracy and economy. But that was all words. Now we actually see it happening. And I think it's happening to the extent that we realize we can't ignore this anymore. Now, gradually, I must say it has taken a long time, but you see the green agenda is the agenda, digital is top of the agenda. And I think it's actually happening now, really.
Yeah, personal observation is we've been talking a lot about the digital transition of society. So, and rationally, we already knew it's happening. But I think through COVID, I would say, our faces put in the middle of it. So we now also feel we're in this digital transition because this is the way we need to run our lives, run our business. It's digitally based.
Yeah, although I agree with you. It has, for us as users, almost immediacy, it brought the digital very near, and we're using it in our daily practice. I must still say that we are coping, struggling really with how digital is affecting, for example, the way we do public service delivery, or how we see the impacts of digital on our set procedures and ways of working. So I'm quite concerned about whether take civil servants and policymakers will be able to escape from some of the ways of working that they have today that make them very fearful to take risks, to make them very fearful to experiment, that make them think in silos and think, well, I use this piece of technology and that's it. It's not more, doesn't have a larger concern. They don't see the larger picture that it's not only about deploying somewhere a piece of technology like AI to detect fraud. It's also the follow-up process that you then have that is established procedures. So I think still in more than one way, in particular, I think around policy making and public services and government, we are see the consequences of this digital change, and it will cost a lot of pain to change that. Change in culture will have to come with that.
And who do you think is best equipped to give that message, to help people along that road to change?
Yeah. Honestly, you know, in this you have these kind of diffusion curves, and in the beginning you have the leaders and the opinion thought leaders, and then you get the early adopters, and then the rest follows. I think if it is about the culture of governance in a broad sense, and in particular, I think the culture in governments, I think unfortunately we are still in the early leadership stage. We need to have people who are willing to give the signal, this we can actually do differently, and then others will become early adopters and make the change. I don't think we are already far on the diffusion curve, how digital is changing governance and governments. Okay. So I would be looking for, perhaps unfortunately, but I would be looking for leadership organizations and leaders that show the way.
Okay, thank you. By the way, how do you see the Institute for Accountability in a Digital Age fit in?
I think the Institute has very successfully been a launchpad to raise the issues of digital accountability, and in a broader sense, accountability. And from that launch pad, you want that the voyage continues.
Mm-hmm.
And so there you see, I think that's leadership that you see there, and that continues to be necessary to make very sharp what are we talking about, to raise awareness and to show there are ways that you can do it differently. So if the institute, for example, can show ways that you can do the combination of law and code from a accountability perspective, you can do it differently, that would be an important signal from which others then can start to adapt that and actually introduce that in their part of the organization. And a lot of that may be experimental, but that's fine. You know, that can become part of the way of our administrative and governance cultures.
Thank you for that, Paul. That's indeed the way we view the Institute. It's very much being a catalyst for a global discussion. And as a catalyst, we just want to point it in the right direction. We cannot own the discussion on accountability. We can merely make certain it's on the table. A final couple of questions, Paul, from my side. Are you optimistic about the future?
I'm optimistic.
Yeah.
Today, we have the discussion climate, and COP26 is going on in Glasgow, and we are really worried. I think we are really worried about what is happening. I'm really worried when I see how far unaccountability, lack of accountability, or misuse has proceeded in, for example, social media and with the large platforms. I'm really worried when increase in tensions, also in the digital world, between China and the United States, and also with Europe. So I think there are many, many reasons that I'm not so optimistic. What I do believe in is that I do see people developing honestly well-intended, good solutions. What I think is we need to make sure that we talk to each other, that we reinforce each other with these good solutions, and we are not becoming captive to this type of pessimism of the big changes that may be overwhelming. So in that sense, I still am optimistic and hopeful that there are enough people around who are willing to make this change, also in the digital world, and they have an idea where they are heading. They need to hold each other's hands, that for sure.
Great, Paul. Hey, thank you so much for sharing your insights. And indeed, we need to find and identify those people, give those people a platform. Hopefully, it will also lead to great discussions and debates how to get there. And so I want to thank you for doing your part and helping us to think and challenge us on a couple of things we need to think about. And specifically, the time issue is one well noted. So thank you for your time, Paul.
Thank you very much, Fritz. Thank you. It was an honor to be interviewed.